April 13th, 1963, Birmingham, Alabama. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves of the Confederate States, a black man is in jail for demanding an end to centuries of discrimination against men and women of his race. The man was Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., and a document which he wrote while imprisoned in the Birmingham City Jail would help to change the course of American history. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States guarantees all Americans equal protection under the law. But in 1963, the segregation of blacks from whites in public facilities was still permitted under the highest laws of the land. Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963, was a city whose public parks, its public accommodations, its lunch counters, its restrooms, its water fountains, even its churches were rigidly segregated by city ordinances, a city where racial hatred had reached epidemic proportions. In the spring of that year, Reverend Martin Luther King, who was then 34 years of age, was invited to Birmingham to help organize marches and consumer boycotts in protest against the city's policies of racial segregation. In the face of the orderly protests, which Reverend King helped to lead, the city of Birmingham reacted with a court order, banning all public demonstrations. King was forced to make a crucial decision. For the first time in his life, he defied a legal court order. He broke the law in order to obey what he considered to be a higher moral law. On Good Friday, 1963, he led 53 protesters in a peaceful march toward downtown Birmingham. All were arrested by the Birmingham police. King had once said that he was not willing to kill, but that he was willing to die for the cause he believed in. The way of nonviolence demonstrated that day by Martin Luther King was an example of a new kind of courage. And the decision he made that day in Birmingham was to mark a turning point in the struggle for human rights. For 24 hours, as reenacted here, Reverend King was held in solitary confinement, unable to contact a lawyer, his family, or his supporters. He was to describe those hours as the longest, most frustrating, and bewildering of his life. On the day that King was jailed, a Birmingham newspaper published an open letter to him, drafted by 8 Alabama clergymen who were considered to be moderates on issues of civil rights. The clergymen were Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish, and all were white.
I'd like to read over this letter and get your approval before it's sent.
Good idea.
We are now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens, directed and led, in part, by outsiders.
We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized. We are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely.
My dear fellow clergymen, since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill, and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient in reasonable terms. I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Like so many experiences of the past, we were confronted with blasted hopes, and the dark shadow of a deep disappointment settled upon us. So we had no alternative except that of preparing for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community.
In Birmingham, recent public events have given indication that we all have the opportunity for a new, constructive, and realistic approach to racial problems. Responsible citizens have undertaken to work on various problems which cause racial friction and unrest.
Because of this, we strongly urge our own Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham.
My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. We know from painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed.
We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized. But we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely.
You speak of impatience. You ask us to wait. For years now, I've heard this word, wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. And we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward the gaining of a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. I guess it's easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs that read white and colored, when your first name becomes nigger and your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, when you are forever fighting a degrading sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait.
When rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and negotiations among local leaders, and not in the streets. We appeal to both our white and Negro citizenry to observe the principles of law and order and common sense.
You express anxiety over our willingness to break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just and there are unjust laws. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. So I can urge men to disobey segregation ordinances because they are morally wrong. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law.
Just as hatred and violence have no sanction in our religious and political traditions, we also point out that such actions as incite to hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those actions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problems. We do not believe that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham.
You speak of extreme measures. You assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of men willing to be co-workers with God. We must use time creatively and forever realize that the time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The urge for freedom will eventually come. This is what has happened to the American Negro. With his black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, he is moving with a sense of cosmic urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. I suppose I should have realized that few members of a race that has oppressed another race could understand or appreciate the deep groans and passionate yearnings of those who had been oppressed. I am thankful, however, that some of our white brothers in the South have grasped the meaning of this social revolution and committed themselves to it. They are still all too few in quantity, but they are big in quality. They have marched with us down nameless streets of the South. They have languished in filthy, roach-infested jails, suffering the abuse and brutality of angry policemen who see them as dirty nigger lovers. They, unlike so many of their moderate brothers and sisters, have recognized the urgency of the moment and sensed the need for powerful action antidotes to combat the disease of segregation. I had hoped that each of you would understand, but again, I've been disappointed. I have heard numerous religious leaders in the South call upon their worshipers to comply with the desegregation decision because it is the law. But I have longed to hear white ministers say, follow this decree because integration is morally right, and the Negro is your brother. I have traveled the length and breadth of Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other southern states. On sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at her beautiful churches, their lofty spires pointing heavenward. Over and over again, I have asked myself, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices of support when tired, bruised, and weary Negro men and women decided to rise up from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest? But I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are presently misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom. Used and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored in this nation without wages. They made cotton king, and they built the homes of their masters while suffering gross injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom, because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. One day, the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the James Merediths, courageously and with a majestic sense of purpose facing jeering and hostile mobs and the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of the pioneer. They will be old, battered, oppressed Negro women, symbolized by a 72-year-old woman of Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people decided not to ride on segregated buses, and responded with ungrammatical profundity to one who inquired about her weariness. My feet is tired, but my soul is rested. They will be the young high school and college students, young ministers of the gospel and a host of their elders, courageously and nonviolently sitting in at lunch counters and willingly going to jail for conscience sake. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream, and thereby carrying our whole nation back to those great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away, and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not-too-distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King, Jr.
Eight days after his imprisonment, Reverend Martin Luther King was released from Birmingham jail, but only after the personal intervention of President John F. Kennedy. The letter King wrote while imprisoned would serve as a blueprint for social change, for the words of its text set forth in eloquent language the philosophy which was to lend strength and purpose to the growing movement for civil rights. In the days that followed Reverend King's release from jail, thousands of young people, following his example of nonviolent protest, poured into the streets of Birmingham to face billy clubs, fire hoses, and snarling police dogs. At the height of their demonstrations, the jails of the city overflowed with more than 2,600 black Americans, many of them high school students. The conscience of America was aroused. As a result, the demands that Martin Luther King had presented to the city of Birmingham were met. And 4 months later, on August 28, 1963, the ranks of the demonstrators swelled to 250,000 strong as blacks and whites together converged on Washington to call for an end to racial discrimination in America. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and for the first time, racial discrimination was expressly forbidden in American public schools, the workplace, and in public accommodations. In the same year, 1964, Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Then, 4 years later, on April 4th, 1968, Reverend King, while continuing his fight to achieve implementation of the civil rights laws, was shot dead by a sniper in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 39 years of age. The guiding light of the civil rights movement in America was dead. But his words would live on to inspire all those who continued to struggle to make real his vision of freedom and dignity for all mankind.
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.